Kicking off at number 5, we've got the Lost Military Exercise. A lot of unexplainable stuff seems to happen to those in the military. Whether it's genuinely paranormal or just a mix of fear and adrenaline, we'll never really know, but this story is a little different. From Reddit user I Love Pink Nips. Back when he was back in the army, his squad ran into something pretty unexplainable during a regular navigation exercise. It was a standard drill. They were given a map and some coordinates, and they had to find certain checkpoints along the way using only a compass and a GPS backup in case of emergency. Everything was going swimmingly, but as they were nearing the end of the exercise, a squad had fallen hopelessly behind and were finally making their way to the last checkpoint. Our narrator was in charge of the last checkpoint and knew that the squad was close by in at least a 1 kilometer radius, but they couldn't yet see them due to the dense foliage. Well, he waited there for over 2 hours, still no sign. He radioed them, no response. Half an hour later, they frantically radioed back. They were lost, walking around in circles, seeing the exact same landmarks. They reported that it was pitch black, but our narrator could see that it was still light out. It was barely 6 PM and the sun was only starting to set. Well, they emergency buzzed their coordinates and they headed to their exact location, but there was no one there, nothing. The forest was eerily quiet, no birds, no insects, just dead silence. It turned out that the squadron didn't actually emerge until several hours later. They reported that they felt like they were being followed the whole time. They kept leaving knife marks on nearby trees to guide their way, but every time they came back, the mark had disappeared. Spooky, eh?
Coming in at 4, the man in the apartment. Posted to r/no sleep by reality subsides, they said, I quote, "There's a tiny man living in my apartment. He roams around when I'm there, moving from place to place, but I can never actually look at him. I'll see him out of the corner of my eye, sitting on a counter, kneeling on the floor, always looking at me, but as soon as my eyes start in his direction, turns out it was just a lamp or a shoe or a cup. He's just always in my peripheral vision. I didn't see him often when I first moved in. I'd occasionally notice a strange shape in the corner, but after looking over, would always pass it off as my imagination. It's my leaning backpack. It's just the garbage can. I tell myself that I was just tired or hungry or drunk. I never really thought about it, then I began to see him more and more often. He began to take shape, to be immediately recognizable. What used to be a vague black shape became something with color, definition, depth. What I used to be able to shrug off as nothing became something real, something ominous. He began to have a presence. I'd still look over, always with the same result, always trying to convince myself I was just seeing things. Eventually I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something there, it wasn't my mind. He used to startle me, now he terrifies me. The innocent, silly realization of, oh, I thought that stack of newspapers was a person is gone. Now he's grown an anonymous presence replaced with a heavy feeling of dread. I've started to see him always. He never leaves, he's always sitting there in the shadows in my peripheral vision watching me. Sometimes I'll try to ignore him for long stretches of time. I won't look over at him. I won't acknowledge him. I'll just pretend I don't see him sitting over there, staring at me. I'll just go on about my business. This is when he began screaming. The first time it happened, I was sitting on my couch watching TV. I could see him in the corner, standing there, staring at me, but I tried to ignore him. I tried to drown him out with the television, turning it up louder and louder so it would capture my attention and make me forget about him. I'd still see he was there, but he'd stay in my periphery. I refused to look at him. I remember watching the show, his presence momentarily forgotten, when suddenly he was right next to me, like he instantaneously leapt forward. He was right next to me. I could feel him staring at me. He screamed, the loudest thing I've ever heard, deafening and mind-consuming. I jumped and reflexively looked over, but it was just my jacket draped on the armrest of the couch, vaguely resembling the shape of a person. Heart pounding, I tried to return to the TV, but I could still see him there, standing in the corner, watching me. Well, this is absolutely terrifying. Tiny man in an apartment. Do you believe it, or is it all in his mind? Coming in at 3, the murder trial. Uploaded to Reddit by Botterwash. To r/askreddit, they responded to the question, what's the scariest story you know that is 100% true? They said, I quote, this is an incident that happened to me about 10 years ago. I live in Melbourne, Australia. I was driving home from work one night around 9 PM midweek, so the roads were quiet. As I was driving downhill, I heard a sound that was like a jet engine roaring behind me. The next thing I knew, a car goes flying past me, going twice the speed limit. It looked like a fairly old crappy car. Car started to get the speed wobbles, and then one of the tires came flying off and rolled at speeds downhill, whilst the car spun out and crashed. I stopped my car to make sure whoever was inside was okay. A guy got out of the car and looked over at me, then started moving extremely quickly towards me. I don't know why, but I hit my eternal locks on the car, which was fortunate because no more than 2 seconds later the guy started grabbing at the driver's side door and smashing on my windscreen, with his fists trying to get in. I'll never forget the crazy look he had in his eyes. I put my foot down on the accelerator and drove off back home. Now you may think the story is scary enough as is, well it gets worse. Let's continue. They go on to say, I decided to swap cars once I got home and drove back to see what was going on. I saw 2 fire trucks and about 4 police close to where the incident happened. When I got back to the crash site, the guy was no longer there, so I decided to head home. The next day at work I was online bored reading the news when I found an article that shocked me. The article was about a guy who had been in a police chase for 1 hour and the police stopped chasing him because it was becoming too dangerous. Turns out the guy was high on meth, had stolen a car an hour drive away, and had been in a hot pursuit since. After crashing the car, the guy apparently crossed to the other side of the road and hailed the first car that appeared, which was a taxi. He got into the taxi and stole it. In the process, he pushed the driver out of the driver's side door and the driver got stuck and dragged at speeds. The driver died from the incident. I called the police and had a detective assigned to me. He fingerprint checked my car and got a statement. I had to testify in the Supreme Court as a key witness in a murder trial. The guy got 30 years and they told me that my testimony was one of the main factors in convicting him. Whoa, how terrifying is that? Remember, always lock your doors, you never know who you might come across down a quiet road. Coming in at 2, Grandma's light is always on. Uploaded to r/nosleep by Saint Entropy, they said, I quote, in one corner of my grandma's living room stood a lamp that was always never turned off. She would change the bulb every week like clockwork, waiting until the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows and filled the room. Even then she hurried, holding her breath until the deed was done and the lamp was back on. I would ask her about it once in a while. Each time she would smile softly, tussle my hair and probably change the subject. I didn't learn the truth until I was 13, the first time I turned off the lamp. I just wanted to see what would happen. Grandma screamed when she walked into the darkened living room, a plate of cookies falling from her hands and crashing to the floor. I could hear her praying under her breath as she raced to turn the light back on. Tears were shining in her eyes when she turned to me, her lips pressed thin. Without warning, she slapped me hard across the face. She gathered me up in her arms and begged for forgiveness. She then finally told me about the lamp. It was a ghost light, she said. Ever since she and my grandpa had bought the house back when they first arrived in America, the spirits of the dead had plagued her. She ended up asking grandpa for help. It was he who had first lit the ghost light, and as long as that beacon burned through the darkness, she had never seen another spirit. Something woke me later that night. I lay in bed listening to the darkness until I heard scratching coming from the living room. Rats were the last thing I wanted to deal with at the moment. I rolled over with a groan, determined to ignore it until the morning. The scratching continued, constantly jerking me from the edge of sleep. I threw the blankets off and stormed out into the hall. I didn't bother turning on the lights as I made my way to the living room. I knew every inch of the house and I moved confidently through it. I was furious at having been woken and my anger was ill prepared for what I found. An elderly woman was crouched in the corner, her gaunt back to me. She was scratching at the floor where the walls met, stopping every few minutes to cock her head. I had no idea how this woman had gotten into my house, and though it was obvious she needed help, my hand shook as I reached out to gently squeeze her shoulder. I meant to ask where she lived, who her caretaker was, but the words were driven from my mind when she turned and I saw her face. Her eyes were solid black, bottomless pits that didn't reflect the moonlight. Her jaw hung impossibly open, unhinged, and the dark tunnel of her mouth spiraled down into her throat. I had a moment to realize who she was, to recognize the familiar map of wrinkles in her face, the curls of her wispy hair. Then my grandma screamed. I shrieked, stumbling backwards away from the nightmare in the corner. My arms flailed in the air, reaching for the nearest lamp, and my hands touched the ghost light. I yanked the chain, filling the room with light, and she was gone. I never turned off the ghost light after that. After letting the bulb burn out one evening, I began changing it every week just as grandma had. Eventually I got married, and luckily for me, my wife was tolerant of my strange fixation on the lamp. The light continued to burn and I lived my life happily enough. Whew, this one truly shook me. There's something about the supernatural that I just don't want to mess with. Keep those lamps turned on, folks. And finally, in at number 1, kidnapping. Posted to r/nosleep by Nix2307, they describe how 7 years ago when they were 12-13, something awful happened to them. I quote, I was walking home from school. It was mid-June. I'd just parted ways with my friend and I had 15 minutes to walk by myself before I got home. I noticed while I was walking with my friend that I kept seeing the same red van along our journey. Now we usually go a longer way so we can walk with all our friends, but this red van just kept popping up. Now I didn't think much of it, I just thought they were different vans, but after a few times I decided to memorize the number plate. After my mum had told me to do so if I ever felt like I was in danger, or if something just didn't feel right. I parted ways with my friend and started on my journey home. I decided to take a route that's a little longer than the one I usually take just because I didn't feel comfortable walking through the park by myself, and I just had a bad feeling through the whole walk home like something bad was going to happen. It was only a few streets away from my home when the red van started to just crawl behind frightened me. This man looked in his late 30s, early 40s, popped his head out and started to try and get my attention, and started catcalling me. I remember looking at him and just telling him that I'm not interested and to leave me alone, but that just angered him. He started screaming at me, telling me to get in the van. I'll forever remember his teeth, those disgusting yellow rotting teeth. They were like something from an anti-smoking advert to scare people into quitting. I told him that I would call the police if he didn't leave me alone. He proceeded to laugh in my face. He sped off a little forwards and parked the van, and he was waiting for me to walk past. I crossed the road and started running, trying to lose the man. Just when I thought I lost him, there he was, pulling up next to me. The sliding doors on the side of the car opened, and there was another man there trying to grab me and pull me in. I screamed like there was no tomorrow. The man managed to grab my shoulder, and I just bit him until I could taste blood. The man let go of me and I ran for my life. I jumped in the bush and hid. I waited until I didn't see the van for at least 30 minutes before I ran home. As soon as I got in, my parents started questioning me. I broke down crying and told them everything. They called the police and I gave them my statement, but nothing ever came of it. I refused to walk home until I turned 16. This is absolutely terrifying. There is nothing more horrible than a child getting abducted. Thank God she reacted the way she did. Stay safe out there, kids.
Kicking off at number 5, the recurring dream. And this story from Reddit user Just Another Gamer is a visceral and horrifying reminder that lingering in the deep recesses of the human mind are some truly perplexing chemical reactions that we can't even begin to comprehend. Have you ever had a recurring dream? Ever thought, what the hell is this all about? What does it mean? Wow, yeah, this person is still asking the same question. As the story goes, Just Another Gamer is an avid cave diver, and since about the age of 6, they explored the unknown caverns across Florida. When they were around 7 or 8 years old, they started to have a strange recurring dream. In the dream, they were exploring a cave and made their way through a little hole in the bottom. Inside was a 10 to 15 foot long corridor a few feet in height and a bent red stop sign at the end, like someone had ripped it off and tossed it inside. As they'd make their way through the corridor, it started descending, quickly opening into a large vertical chamber with a path leading down in a corkscrew pattern. Then things would get blurry, but they'd remember the image of trash scattered around the walls, things writhing in the distance, strange things, animals and corpses maybe. Amidst them, they'd see their own family, each one of them being tortured and killed, but in the dream, all they could do was scream. Our narrator had this dream for years and years, always the same thing, until 7 or 8 years later, when they were around 15, they went on a caving trip with their father, a place called Dog Drop out in the Tampa Bay area. While when they were descending on a 30-foot rappel, they felt a strange, familiar feeling. When they reached the bottom and looked up, they saw the exact same corridor from their dream. The same strange clutters of trash against the wall, the same red stop sign. Instantly, they were hit with this overwhelming sense of nausea and primal fear, and they froze. All they could do is scream to leave, and eventually their father paid attention to them and packed up their things to leave. Whatever was lurking down there, our narrator knew that it wasn't good. They'd seen it before, deep in the recesses of their own memory, and thankfully, they never found out. Coming in at number 4, Nick at Night. We all remember Nick at Night, right? Late night cartoons that were pure amazing. While Reddit user Saint Sparkles had some pretty awesome parents who let them sleep in the living room on weekend nights, chill out on the couch and watch Nick at Night until they fell asleep. So one night during this most joyous of weekend treats, Saint Sparkles woke up on the sofa with a strange prickly feeling. It was like an instinct, something tugging at their sleeve saying, "Wake up, something's not quite right." Well, they bolted upright in a sitting position and their eyes quickly fixed on the front window. You see, our narrator lived in rural Georgia and there was a hell of a lot of trees surrounding their property. In the perfect light cast from the moon, they could see a strange silhouette, or a person, perhaps a creature, something standing in the tree outside their home. Their dog seemed to sense it too and quickly dashed to the window, snarling at the glass. Long story short, their parents heard the commotion, Dad flipped out and grabbed a gun, headed out into the forest screaming, "Get off my property." He found no one though, and Saint Sparkles quickly went back to their bedroom to sleep. Just as they were dozing off though, their gaze cast out of their bedroom window. The figure, it's there again, this time standing in a tree closer to the house. Whatever it was, he put a finger over his mouth and shushed, and then just like that, turned away and ran. Yikes. Next up at number 3, odd house. This one is equal parts charming and insanely unnerving, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. Reddit user Memory Eater painted a beautiful picture of their childhood home in a time gone Ask Reddit thread from 4 years ago. As a child, they lived in a bizarre little house. It was incredibly tall and thin, full of quirks like 2 fully functioning fireplaces, a weird shower in the basement, and an old-timey rope-pulled dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to their bedroom. The fact that it was incredibly old also meant that it was falling apart and in short was a complete money sink, so their parents sold the house and they had to move. As Memory Eater was cleaning out their closet, they stumbled across something that they'd never noticed before. A strange attic entrance to their walk-in wardrobe. Of course, being an adventurous kid, they opened it up and headed up a strange set of steps. The first thing that they noticed was that it wasn't as dark as it should have been. The place was strung with weird red Christmas lights that seemed to have been recently lit. There was also a bed the place seemed lived in, an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and bizarrely a small mint coloured fridge which still worked. The strangest thing though was the bones. A lot of bones, heaped in piles in the corner, small, large, clean and white, scattered throughout the small room. 2 of them had been burnt black, and scrawled on the wall was a dark coloured bone-charred message, the word sorry over and over again. Someone had been sleeping over their head for 8 years, and what the hell, this is insanity. Well, they never found out who or what it was. Swinging in at number 2, Something at Sea. Yeah, this one is pretty damn weird. True or no, I don't know, but it's creepy as hell. Again, another military story. Told you weird stuff always happens to them. This one comes from Reddit user Engerby. The story reportedly takes place roughly around a year ago while on board the USS New York, operating somewhere remotely in the Atlantic. They were staging a mock military exercise with half the crew posing as pirates and the other seizing possession of their ship. While as their squad was heading out on a small boarding vessel, things got a little bit weird and a thick fog descended on their position. It was only meant to be a short 5-minute ride to their destination, but over 10 minutes had passed at this point and they still hadn't hit. They were lost in the middle of nowhere, as if they'd fallen asleep and ended up miles completely off course. Eventually, after the engine had cut out already once before, they came across a massive old rusted ship, like a cruise liner that had been pulled from the bottom of the ocean. Of course, they boarded it, but inside they found something even stranger. They found reams and reams of books, sketches of some kind in notepads, of creatures that weren't supposed to exist. Massive marine animals, twisted squids, ungodly whales, and a note. These are what I have observed on my 14-month journey. Well, of course, they quickly got the hell out of there, and for fear of sounding insane, they refused to report it to their superior officers. Well, worse things have happened at sea, eh? And finally, at our number 1 spot, my favourite ever Reddit story, sticky notes. Not exactly a horror story, but so much more potentially terrifying. 3 years ago, Reddit user rbradbury1920 posted to the legal advice subreddit about a strange series of events that had recently plagued him. It first began when he found a yellow sticky note in a handwriting that wasn't his own on his desk at home, reminding him to run some personal errands, but hadn't told anybody about. Very odd, but he chalked it up to something that he'd done in his sleeping state, half awake. A few days later, he found another sticky note in the exact same handwriting, telling him to make sure he'd saved his documents. He freaked out this time, but there were no signs of a break-in and no signs of criminal intent. The next time, he found another post-it note saying, "Our landlord isn't letting me talk to you, but it's important we do." What the hell? Well, he was convinced that it was his landlord, playing games with him, breaking into his apartment. He found a letter from when he first moved in, and the handwriting was seemingly identical to his landlord's. The big twist? Well, Reddit user Kakalak pretty much saved this guy's life. In the comments, after a thorough analysis of the situation, he concluded that his apartment was leaking carbon monoxide, and he was correct. Our Reddit user had been suffering from slow carbon monoxide poisoning and was experiencing hallucinations that led to him writing sticky notes to himself. If it would have continued, in all likelihood, he could have ended up dead. So, good job, Kakalak.
Coming in at 5, the Tinder date. Uploaded to r/NoSleep by Small Dog on Desk, great name. They explain their strange Tinder date that may have led to a stalking. I quote, "I think my Tinder date is stalking me. I swear. I don't know what to do because I can't prove it. I can smell him in my home. The putrid stench of grease and third world sewers, mixed with body odor. My apartment has absolutely reeked for days. I haven't gone in except to pick up clean clothes and drop off old ones. I first noticed the smell when I came back from our date, alone. The smell was faint, barely there. For a moment I thought it was my asthma of garbage coming from the open bathroom window. When I closed it, the city scum stuck to my skin. Like the rest of my life, the date had gone just wrong. Gerald, he was strange, he looked like his pictures except that Gerald was greasy. No, he was certifiably oily. His hair looked like it was smeared with a slick, almost dripping pomade, and his skin had a suspicious rainbow sheen, like oil on water. His voice matched the rest of him, sleazy, oozing, cystic. I was instantly turned off. Embarrassingly, I was on Tinder because I had no friends. I can see why, judge much. I had just moved to a middle-sized industrial city in Southeast Asia for my company's 6-month overseas industrial attachment. My colleagues were all middle-aged, and I was absolutely craving for some under 30 interaction. I swiped right on Gerald about 2 weeks ago. An empty profile, but lots of pictures. He seemed normal enough, cute in the tall, lean sort of way. That said, I won't deny that the idea of having a local boy take me around made the idea of 6 months in the middle of basically an industrial nowhere somewhat palatable. When Gerald stood up, he left a slick gloss on the seat. I dropped half of my bill, mumbled something about work, and ran off into the cab that had been waiting for me. I tipped him an extra 20 to wait. I don't remember what was talked about during our date. I do remember seeing him through the window of the restaurant. His eyes were slimy, roving, watching me leave. He texted me in the cab asking for another date. I politely declined, but his replies not so congenial. The smell. It was the smell that made me decide to leave. It was still faint then, just a lingering scent, but it made me nervous, a primal uncomfortable feeling of something that was not quite right. I threw some clothes into my gym duffel, then called a cab to the closest Holiday Inn. That was about half a week ago. The texts had been coming in once every few hours. I ignore them now. Last night I went to my apartment to get more clothes. The smell soaked the front door, spilling into the corridor. I smelled it the moment my lift opened. It grew stronger as I approached the apartment. My doorknob gleamed. It was polished, rubbed raw by scrabbling hands. I didn't need to touch it to know that it would be oily, that it would be putrid. I rushed back to the safety of the hotel, the safety of other people. I sat in the lobby for hours, basking in the fading chatter of tourists, the glow of the ceiling lamps, breathing, just breathing. The desk staff looked at me oddly, but no one said anything. My legs tingled when I stood up. I was exhausted. I staggered. Lobby, lift, corridor, bedroom, bed. I was just sinking into the mattress when I noticed it. The smell of faint, rotting oil. I rubbed the fingers of my right hand together. When did they get covered in grease? Whew. Okay, I'll say that the scariest part of this story initially was the girl's judgment. She tore in and she tore hard. Respect. However, the ending definitely gave me chills.
Coming in at number 4, The Boat Mechanic. And this short and sweet story comes from Two Otters in a Coat, which is a fantastic name, may I add. Telling the real life tale about a guy that they knew who made their living working as a boat mechanic. Now, random acts of violence are a different kind of fear, but this one takes it to a whole new level. As the story goes, one Saturday their friend, the boat mechanic, was working alone in their workshop, making some final repairs to a boat that had been brought in. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the mechanic wakes up and he's on the ground. Now, he knew that there was water beneath him just before he's working on a boat, so he assumed that he'd been electrocuted and the shock had knocked him away unconsciously. The strangest part is that he could vaguely sense someone behind him, so he started yelling for help, letting them know that he'd been electrocuted. Whoever was behind him turned and left without a word. He keeps screaming for help until eventually a neighbouring business heard his pleas and came to his aid. Later on though, once he'd been seen by the nearby hospital, he discovered from the police that he wasn't electrocuted at all. According to the police, someone had entered his workshop while he was working and hit him on the back of the head with a mallet from his own toolbox. And nothing was stolen from the shop. Now, this person was never caught and CCTV wasn't clear enough to identify the perp, but as it seems they were walking by and spontaneously decided to knock him out, potentially with the intention of killing him, for seemingly no reason whatsoever. Now that's terrifying. Next up at number 3, The Closet. This story comes from Tighty Whitey's 37, which is as the story goes, back in 2002 they were living in an old apartment that had been built back in the year 1900, making it just over 100 years old when they moved in. Now, everything in the apartment was great apart from one thing: the bedroom, and in particular the closet in the bedroom, which gave them the unnerving feeling that someone or something was watching them when it was left ajar. So much so that when this particular Reddit user was sleeping, they'd often hear strange gasping noises, and it would seem that they were coming from within the closet. They'd check, nothing there. but for that reason, the closet would always stay closed. A month or so of them staying in the apartment, there was a loud bang on the closet door one night, and our narrator was woken from their sleep. It was pitch black, yet they sensed something that emerged from the closet, standing over them, a pressure holding them down in their bed. And yeah, you could explain this away with sleep paralysis, but the end of this story may just make you think twice. Throughout their stay at the apartment, the encroaching sense of dread from the closet had never quite left, and even their friends would comment on the strange feeling that they felt when in the vicinity of the closet. It got so bad that eventually they had the chance to move to another unit, so they jumped at the opportunity, packed their stuff up, and got the hell out of there. Well, a few years later, the owners were renovating the building when our narrator was walking past the doorway of their old apartment. Curiously, they caught the building manager, who was painting in the bedroom, and began talking about the strange feeling that they felt whilst living there. Without thinking twice, the building owner explained that the former tenant of the apartment had they'd hanged themselves in the closet. And not only that, but the original designer of the building, who had also stayed in the same apartment, had also committed suicide. They'd hanged themselves in the exact same closet. Swinging in at number 2, the baby upstairs. And this story comes from Reddit user UrgeHouse666, spooky name bud, who explains an incredibly strange moment during their teenage years. As the tale goes, when they were in high school, their uncle would throw them a couple of bucks every now and then to babysit his kids with their aunt. But they lived in a beautiful old 2-story house by the water in a nice area, and the 2 children were around 3 and 6. One day, our narrator was sitting in the den scrolling through their phone when they started to hear a baby crying. Of course, it must be the 3-year-old distressed upstairs, so doing their babysitting duty, they headed to check on them. They called out a couple of times while heading upstairs, to no response. They called for their aunt to see if she was dealing with it. No response again. When they turned to start walking up the stairs, they caught a glimpse outside in the yard. It was their aunt with her 2 children laughing and playing on the grass. They heard the babies cry again, the noise coming from upstairs, and all of the hairs on our narrator's body stood on end, a chill running down their spine. Quietly, they turned around, walked down the stairs, got in their car and drove away. The baby was still crying when they closed the door behind them. A few years later, our narrator was drunk at a family party, and they mustered the courage to tell their uncle the story. He said that him and his wife used to hear the baby too, crying when no one else was around. According to him, the previous owners had a small child that had died of cot death in the same room that the cries were coming from. Spooky stuff. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the attic. And again, another tale of spooky kids in upstairs locations. Sorry, I hope that wasn't a spoiler. This story comes from Reddit user Ghouls, who tells the tale of the time that they'd moved into their new childhood home. You see, their family had managed to snag a deal because previously the house was used as a model home to show off the housing design of the surrounding area. Upstairs, it had this loft area that had 2 stairwells that attached to it on either end, one in the front and one in the back. You could pretty much hear everything from up there as it was so open. Anyway, one day our narrator and their 2 friends, a guy and a girl, were hanging out in the loft. It was high school, so teenagers being teenagers, the pair were pretty handsy. They were watching TV all snuggled together on the sofa when our narrator got up to take a leak. When they got back, the 2 of them were on completely different ends of the couch, their faces drained of all colour. Our narrator asked them what was up, and the guy said, "Your little sister is home." Instantly, our narrator's face went white as a sheet. "What's wrong?" the girl asked. You see, our narrator didn't have a little sister, and he asked them what made them think he did. They replied that they'd heard her and then they'd seen her, but for all they knew, no one was in the house. To this day, our narrator's 2 best friends swear that they heard a little girl laugh and run up the stairs, hitting her hand on each step like she was running up on all 4s, like kids do. As it turned out, before it was a model home, a family had lived there, and their young daughter had been playing upstairs in the loft. She'd climbed a railing, slipped and fell to her death, and no one thought to mention that fact when they were flipping the house. No wonder they got such a good deal.